so we'll try and move along. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to put the current discussion about Social Security into context and then try to make sense, if that's possible, of the role that the President's Fiscal Commission is playing in the discussion. The Social Security debate is the longest-running domestic political tug-of-war in Washington. It goes back 30 years, and in a way, not much has changed in all of that time. The issues involved and the positions that conservatives and liberals have staked out are almost exactly the same ones as when Reagan entered office. This last 30 years also coincides pretty closely with the long period of wage stagnation for American workers. And wage stagnation is the primary cause of whatever funding problem Social Security faces today. The evidence of this is in the trustees' reports. In 1998, the projected year of exhaustion for the trust funds was 2032. By 2003, when the effects of a half-decade of rapid wage growth during the second Clinton administration had played themselves through, the date of exhaustion was 2042. Last year, after a long relapse into wage stagnation, the date of exhaustion slid back to 2037, and that's where it remains today, this year in the trustees' latest report. There's one other big source of pressure on Social Security, which is health care costs. The reform bill that passed this year may help to ease these costs, maybe even more than is being projected, if it's allowed to remain in place. But we won't know the direction for sure for at least 5 to 7 years. Meanwhile, more and more of seniors' Social Security checks are being eaten away in health care expenses. In 1970, 5 years after Medicare was enacted, seniors' out-of-pocket expenses for health care were minuscule. Today, they pay an average of a bit more than $250 a month out of a Social Security check that averages about $1,100 a month. By 2084, the trustees project that Medicare Parts B and D will absorb more than half of what you get in a Social Security check, and that's not counting other health care costs that aren't covered by Medicare. In other words, if the health care system isn't brought under control, Social Security will have to be made more generous because increasingly it's a specifically health care benefit, not a retirement income benefit. Instead, the opposite is happening. Thanks to the hikes in the age of eligibility, which were enacted in the 1983 amendments to the Social Security Act, and to changes in the program's inflation formula during the Clinton administration, the value of Social Security benefits has been going down, not up. Seniors are going to feel this more acutely over the next 2 decades as the replacement rate for final average income slips from 39% to 31%, even if nothing further is done to downgrade the system. But even healthcare costs would be less of a problem if wages weren't stuck in neutral or declining. So the real dividing line in the issue of Social Security hinges on wages. Keep in mind that there are actually 3 sides in the Social Security debate. There's the traditional defenders of Social Security who want to keep the basic structure as it is and oppose further erosion of benefits. The second are the privatizers who essentially want to funnel workers' payroll taxes to the financial services industry in the form of private accounts. The third group are the deficit hawks who essentially want to simply continue to cut benefits as much as they possibly can. The privatizers and the deficit hawks don't always see eye to eye, but the end result of their proposals is the same. The traditional Social Security benefit would either be zeroed out or would be placed on a fast track to becoming so small that it would be inconsequential. Each of these 3 groups has a different view on the crucial issue of wages. The pro-Social Security types tend to want to see wages start rising again because that's the best way to assure that the program's health is going to continue to be healthy going forward. The privatizers hate taxes and would like to see income from private investments replace wages as the main source of wealth for just about everyone. That's what Karl Rove used to call the ownership society. The deficit hawks tend to agree, although they're not as wedded to the idea of private accounts directly being carved out of payroll taxes. What those 2 groups do tend to agree on is that the privatizers and the deficit hawks is that the direction of that wages have been going in for the last 30 years is not going to change and probably shouldn't. That means that if they get their way, income tax and payroll tax revenues are going to trend down, not up, over the long term. That means government, including Social Security, is going to have to shrink. It's becoming a zero-sum game, and the privatizers and the deficit hawks aren't very interested in doing anything to change this. That puts us as a society in a race to the bottom that logically means cutting Social Security and cutting it until there's nothing left to cut. The members of the Deficit Commission are almost all privatizers and deficit hawks. In other words, they more or less buy into this zero-sum picture of where we're headed economically. Many of them have preached for years that Social Security needs to be curbed or privatized, even though it doesn't represent a very big part of the long-term fiscal problem. The key figure here is how much pressure Social Security places on GDP. In other words, on the economy as a whole. The answer is not very much. According to the trustees' report, the latest one, the Social Security deficit over 75 years, in other words, the benefit promises that payroll taxes don't cover all by themselves, will come to just 0.7% of GDP. According to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, that's about the same share as the cost of extending the Bush tax cuts for the top 2% of taxpayers. It's equal to about 1.92% of taxable payroll, which is small enough that the whole deficit could be the whole Social Security deficit could be eliminated by a series of modest boosts in payroll tax that would never exceed the rate of inflation or the rate of wage growth if we should ever experience such a thing again. This is how Social Security was rebalanced in previous years, and this is the way it could be done again very easily. But again, that's off the table with the Deficit Commission. Another interesting comparison is between the size of the Social Security deficit and the magnitude of federal tax expenditures. Deficit hawks like to caricature Social Security and Medicare as entitlements because they're automatic payments that are determined by a formula and not by Congress each year. But tax expenditures, like the home mortgage interest deduction, industry-specific write-offs, and deductions for 401ks and other tax-deferred savings plans, are actually entitlements too. They're determined by a formula, and lawmakers don't review them year to year. They're calculated to total $5 trillion over the next 5 years. The Social Security shortfall is projected to total $5.4 trillion over the next 75 years. But the Deficit Commission isn't likely to touch tax expenditures because they reward wealth building rather than wage earning. The Commission seems to have agreed not to even discuss the Bush tax cuts. Reportedly, several members are actually pushing the Commission to recommend more cuts in taxes, corporate and capital gains taxes. That means any real deficit reduction they recommend will come from spending cuts, not tax hikes, even though some members of the Commission, including Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, advertised it as an attempt to achieve a compromise between revenue raisers and spending cuts. Now, partly this is politics. Republicans smell victory in November, so it's understandable that they wouldn't be interested in holding hands with the Blue Dogs and jumping off a cliff together. The president, meanwhile, has been careful about saying anything that would suggest he's undercutting the good work of his commission, and that makes it hard for his administration to exercise any influence on it at all. It's a kind of a self-imposed gag rule that we have. What I'm suggesting, though, is that the fundamental problem here is a kind of tacit understanding that seems to include everyone in policymaking Washington except the more progressive Democrats, and that is that there's not much to be done about wage growth, or even, it seems, about unemployment in the next few years. This threatens to become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in which many people will find themselves permanently cast aside by the workforce. The quality of most American jobs continues to decline, wages continue to stagnate, and payroll tax receipts dwindle. And if that continues, one of these days we may find ourselves with a real Social Security crisis, because just like you can't solve Medicare's problems separately from those of the larger healthcare system, you can't solve Social Security's problems without creating jobs for American workers.